The cruelest betrayals are rarely loud. They happen the moment someone remembers a stranger's coffee but forgets the woman waiting at home. Claire Whitmore stood alone in the candlelit dining room of Whitmore Estate, smoothing the front of the midnight blue dress Damien had once called his favorite. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, each echo settling into the silence like another reminder that she was still waiting. Outside, early autumn rain rolled softly across the hills of Greenwich, Connecticut, blurring the lights beyond the tall windows. The dining table had been set for 2 since 6 o'clock. Fine china rested untouched. 2 crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of the candles. At the center of the table sat a small chocolate birthday cake decorated with elegant white frosting and 35 tiny silver stars. Only one candle remained unlit. Earlier that morning, every member of the household staff had quietly wished Claire a happy birthday. She had thanked each of them with a warm smile, convinced the only greeting that truly mattered would come from her husband. She had even baked the cake herself despite having a full kitchen staff because she wanted one part of the evening to come from her own hands. She glanced at her phone again. No message, no missed call, no simple happy birthday. She told herself not to be disappointed. Damien was always busy. Meetings ran longer than expected. Unexpected situations demanded his attention. She had repeated those explanations for years until they sounded less like comfort and more like habit. Still, tonight felt different. Tonight she wanted him to remember without a calendar reminder or anyone prompting him. At exactly 8:37, headlights swept across the front entrance. Claire's heart reacted before her thoughts did. She straightened her posture, brushed an invisible wrinkle from her dress, and smiled at her reflection in the window. Moments later, the heavy front door opened. Damien Whitmore stepped inside, removing his dark overcoat while ending a business call. Before he even looked toward the dining room, he slipped his phone from his pocket and recorded a quick voice memo. Reminder for tomorrow. Double espresso. Oat milk. No sugar. She switched last month. He saved the recording, returned the phone to his pocket, and walked forward without realizing Claire had heard every word. She lowered her eyes for only a second. He had remembered a tiny change in his assistant's morning coffee. He had forgotten the day his wife had quietly waited months to share with him. Damien finally noticed Claire standing beside the table. For the briefest moment, she believed recognition might cross his face. Instead, he offered a tired smile. Long day, he asked casually. Claire looked at him, then at the untouched birthday cake glowing beneath the candlelight. She could have reminded him. She could have pointed to the flowers, the candles, the carefully prepared dinner, or simply said the words he had forgotten. Instead, she smiled with a calmness that surprised even herself. It was, she answered softly. But it's almost over. Damien accepted the reply without hearing the meaning beneath it. His thoughts had already drifted back toward tomorrow's meetings, contracts, and schedules. Claire struck a match, lit the single candle herself, and watched the tiny flame flicker against the crystal glasses. She closed her eyes for one quiet moment and made a wish she never spoke aloud. When she opened them again, she gently blew out the candle before anyone else in the room even realized it had been burning. Damien barely noticed when Claire carried the untouched cake into the kitchen herself. One of the housekeepers quietly stepped forward, offering to help, but Claire answered with a small shake of her head that ended the conversation before it began. She carefully placed the cake inside the refrigerator, closed the door, and stood there for a moment, staring at her own faint reflection in the stainless steel. The candle had burned for less than a minute, yet the smell of melted wax lingered in the air much longer. Behind her, the dining room remained exactly as she had arranged it hours earlier, except now the silence felt heavier than the crystal plates or polished silverware. Damien had already disappeared into his office at the opposite end of the estate. Through the closed door, the faint rhythm of conference calls resumed as though the evening had never paused. Claire walked upstairs without making a sound. She removed the midnight blue dress with the same care she had used when putting it on, hung it neatly inside the closet, changed into a comfortable cream-colored sweater, and tied her hair back. There were no tears, not because she was stronger than disappointment, but because disappointment had become too familiar to surprise her anymore. She glanced once at the elegant gift box resting on the dresser. Months earlier, she had purchased a vintage fountain pen engraved with Damien's initials after hearing him admire one in a collector's shop. She had imagined laughing together over dinner while exchanging gifts. Now she quietly placed the unopened box into the bottom drawer and closed it. Downstairs, Damien finally emerged from his office nearly an hour later. The dining room lights were off. Only a lamp near the staircase remained on. He frowned slightly. "Did Claire already eat?" he asked one of the staff members. "No, sir," the woman answered carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore said she wasn't hungry." Damien nodded absent-mindedly. "Tell the kitchen not to wait for me tomorrow morning. I'll leave early." He never asked why two untouched place settings still sat on the table. He never questioned the flowers or the folded linen napkins or why fresh wax had hardened beside an empty cake stand. To him, it simply looked like another dinner that hadn't happened. The next morning, Claire woke before sunrise as she always had. Habit carried her through the quiet halls of Whitmore Estate. She brewed coffee for herself, watched the first lights settle across the gardens, and listened to birds replace the rain that had fallen all night. Usually she prepared breakfast knowing Damien would rush downstairs with a file in one hand and his phone in the other. Usually she reminded him to eat something before leaving. Usually she tucked a travel mug into his hand because she knew he would forget it otherwise. This morning she did none of those things. She poured a single cup for herself and carried it onto the terrace. At exactly 7 o'clock, Damien walked into the kitchen, buttoning the cuff of his shirt while reading emails. He looked toward the counter, paused for a brief second, then opened a cabinet searching for a mug. "Did everyone oversleep?" he muttered. A housekeeper hesitated before answering. "Mrs. Whitmore is already outside, sir." Damien glanced through the window and saw Claire sitting alone with her coffee, quietly watching the sunrise. Something about the image felt unfamiliar. For years, she had always been inside, making sure everyone else was ready before thinking about herself. He considered walking outside, but his phone rang before he reached the door. "Morning, Emily," he answered immediately. "Yes, I reviewed the agenda. Good catch on moving the investor meeting. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Claire heard only fragments of the conversation drifting through the open window. She didn't react. She simply lifted her coffee and continued watching the sunlight spread across the lawn. Damien ended the call, grabbed his briefcase, and hurried toward the front entrance. Halfway out the door, he called back. "I'll probably be late again tonight." Claire turned her head just enough for him to see her profile. "Drive safely," she replied with quiet politeness. There was no disappointment in her voice. No request for him to come home early. No reminder that they had not shared a real dinner together in weeks. Damien left feeling oddly unsettled. He couldn't explain why. Claire hadn't argued. She hadn't complained. She hadn't even looked upset. Yet as his car disappeared down the long driveway lined with maple trees, the estate somehow felt less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished building where two people simply happened to live under the same roof. The changes began so quietly that no one inside Whitmore Estate could say exactly when they started. There was no dramatic argument, no slammed doors, no emotional confrontation that echoed through the halls. Instead, small routines simply disappeared, one after another, until the life Claire and Damien had built together no longer looked the same. On Monday evening, the dining table remained unset. The kitchen staff exchanged uncertain glances before preparing only a light meal for Claire. She thanked them, ate alone in the breakfast room overlooking the gardens, and returned to the library with a novel she had been meaning to finish for months. When Damien arrived home close to 11, he paused outside the empty dining room. For a brief moment, he wondered why the lights were off, then dismissed the thought. Claire must have learned not to wait up anymore, he told himself. That was probably healthier for both of them. Tuesday passed much the same way. Claire spent the afternoon volunteering at a children's literacy center in downtown Greenwich, something she had postponed repeatedly over the years because she always wanted to be available whenever Damien unexpectedly came home early. She smiled as she read stories aloud to children gathered on colorful rugs, surprised by how peaceful 2 simple hours could feel when she was no longer watching the clock. Meanwhile, Damien's day unfolded with military precision. Emily, his executive assistant, had every meeting organized before he stepped into the office. She reminded him about conference calls, adjusted travel schedules, and quietly placed a fresh cup of coffee on his desk exactly the way he preferred it. "No sugar," she said with a friendly smile. "Just the way you like it." Damien nodded appreciatively without looking up from the documents in front of him. Efficiency had become so normal that he rarely noticed it anymore. Wednesday morning brought another subtle change. For years, Claire had always texted Damien around lunchtime with a simple message asking whether he had eaten. Sometimes he replied. Often he forgot. That afternoon his phone remained silent. Around 1 o'clock, he glanced at the screen almost unconsciously, expecting the familiar notification that never came. He waited another 15 minutes before convincing himself she was probably busy. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived when another meeting demanded his attention. At home, Claire had stopped arranging fresh flowers in Damien's office. She no longer replaced family photographs with newer ones or left handwritten notes wishing him luck before important negotiations. None of it felt angry. She simply stopped doing things that had gone unnoticed for years. The housekeepers observed the differences before anyone else. Mrs. Alvarez, the longtime house manager, quietly mentioned one afternoon, "Mrs. Whitmore seems lighter somehow." Another employee looked confused. "She smiles more." Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. "Yes, but never when Mr. Whitmore is around." That Friday evening, Claire attended a charity art exhibit with an old college friend she had recently reconnected with. She laughed more during those 3 hours than she had in weeks, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because no one expected her to monitor the time or leave early. When she returned home just after 9, Damien's car had not yet arrived. She changed into comfortable clothes, made herself chamomile tea, and settled into the sunroom with a blanket across her lap. At 10:45, Damien entered the estate carrying another stack of files. He noticed the lights glowing softly from the sunroom and walked toward them. Claire looked up from her book with a polite smile. "You're home." "I am," he answered, almost expecting her to ask how his day had gone. She didn't. Instead, she placed a bookmark between the pages, wished him good night, and headed upstairs. Damien watched her disappear down the staircase. Something about the exchange felt incomplete, though he couldn't explain why. There had been no argument, no disappointment in her voice, no sadness on her face. She had simply stopped reaching toward him. As he stood alone in the quiet room, his phone vibrated with a calendar reminder Emily had scheduled for the following week. Every appointment, every meeting, every deadline appeared exactly where it belonged. Damien looked around the silent estate and felt an unfamiliar emptiness settle over him. Without realizing it, he had mistaken Claire's silence for understanding, when in truth it was the first sign that she was slowly learning how to build a life that no longer depended on waiting for him. By the second week after Claire's birthday, the rhythm of Damien Whitmore's life had become so perfectly organized that he rarely needed to think about anything beyond the next meeting. Emily seemed to anticipate every detail before he asked. When a conference room changed at the last minute, she had already redirected everyone. When traffic delayed an important guest, she adjusted the schedule without interrupting his conversations. If he skipped lunch, a fresh sandwich appeared on his desk exactly when his calendar showed a 10-minute opening. "Your 3 o'clock moved to 3:15, Emily reminded him one afternoon as she placed a folder beside his laptop. "I also had the florist send white orchids to Mr. Hawthorne's wife. Today is their anniversary." Damien nodded. "Good thinking." He signed another document without looking up. "Anything else?" Emily glanced at her tablet. "Your dry cleaning will be delivered before 6, and I rescheduled Friday's flight because of the weather forecast." Perfect. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, yet everything around Damien continued to operate with remarkable precision. At Whitmore Estate, life had become equally orderly, but for very different reasons. Claire no longer organized her days around Damien's unpredictable schedule. She enrolled in a local arts foundation that restored historical buildings throughout Fairfield County. She attended planning meetings twice a week, met volunteers from different backgrounds, and slowly rediscovered interests she had quietly abandoned after their marriage. One Saturday morning, she left the estate wearing jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes instead of waiting at home in case Damien unexpectedly had free time. Mrs. Alvarez smiled as Claire picked up her car keys. "Will you be home for dinner, Mrs. Whitmore?" Claire returned the smile. "Probably not. Don't keep the kitchen open for me." It was a simple sentence, but the staff exchanged surprised glances after she left. For years, dinner had always revolved around the possibility that Mr. Whitmore might arrive home. Now that possibility no longer shaped Claire's evenings. Damien noticed the difference without understanding its cause. He arrived home before 8 that same Saturday, earlier than usual after a business dinner had been canceled. The estate felt unusually quiet. No music drifted from the sitting room. No fresh flowers had appeared in the foyer. He loosened his tie and asked one of the housekeepers, "Where's Claire?" "She went into town this morning, sir." "Is she expected back soon?" "She didn't say." Damien looked toward the staircase for a moment before walking into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water and stood there longer than necessary. It felt strange that no one knew exactly when Claire would return, yet he quickly dismissed the feeling as unreasonable. She deserved hobbies. She deserved friends. Wasn't that what he had wanted all along? For years he had worried she depended too much on him. Now she seemed independent, confident, and busy. That should have been good news. Late that evening, Claire quietly entered through the front door carrying a canvas tote filled with architectural sketches and restoration plans. She looked genuinely relaxed. "You're still awake," she said with pleasant surprise as she found Damien reading reports in the library. "I finished earlier than expected," he answered. "How was your day?" "Wonderful." The word caught him off guard. Claire described helping preserve a 19th-century community hall, laughing about an elderly volunteer who insisted every crooked nail had its own personality. Damien listened politely, but after only a minute his phone buzzed. Emily had emailed revised briefing notes for Monday morning's negotiations. "Sorry," he said automatically while glancing at the screen. "I need to review this tonight." Claire simply nodded. "Of course." She picked up her empty teacup and left the room without another word. Damien continued reading the email, barely noticing when the library door closed. Across the hall, Claire paused outside the family gallery where framed photographs lined the walls. Most showed vacations, charity events, and holiday celebrations from earlier years. In nearly every picture, Damien stood beside her with an arm around her shoulders, smiling naturally instead of checking a phone or thinking about tomorrow's schedule. She studied one photograph taken during their first autumn in Connecticut, then continued upstairs with a quiet sigh that held neither bitterness nor hope. Downstairs, Damien finally finished his work close to midnight. As he walked through the darkened hallway, he noticed the gallery lights still glowing softly. For the first time in years, he stopped to look at the photographs himself. He lingered only a few seconds before turning them off and heading to bed, never realizing that while Emily had become the person who remembered every detail of his professional life, Claire had quietly begun creating a life where she no longer needed to remember his schedule at all. Another week passed, and Whitmore Estates settled into a new routine that no one had planned, but everyone quietly accepted. The house remained immaculate. Meals were prepared on time. The gardens continued to bloom beneath the crisp Connecticut autumn sky, yet something invisible had vanished from its halls. It was not noise that was missing. It was anticipation. Claire no longer glanced toward the front windows whenever headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. She no longer asked Mrs. Alvarez to keep dinner warm, just in case. If Damien texted that he would be late, she simply replied, "Thank you for letting me know," then continued whatever she had already planned. Most evenings she attended restoration committee meetings, visited the literacy center, or enjoyed dinner with volunteers who had gradually become genuine friends. Her calendar, once almost completely empty except for Damien's schedule, now contained appointments that belonged entirely to her own life. Damien, meanwhile, noticed only scattered details that felt oddly out of place. One Tuesday afternoon, he found himself looking at the clock shortly before 6 and wondering what Claire might be cooking. A second later, he remembered she hadn't prepared dinner in weeks. The thought disappeared as another meeting began. On Thursday, he reached home before sunset, carrying the quiet satisfaction of finishing an important negotiation ahead of schedule. For the first time in months, he imagined surprising Claire with an evening together. As he entered the estate, he expected to hear music from the piano room or find her arranging flowers in the foyer. Instead, the house was unusually still. Mrs. Alvarez greeted him with her usual warmth. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Damien looked around. "Where's Claire?" "She drove to New Haven this afternoon, sir. The Historical Society invited her to speak about the restoration project. She mentioned she may stay for dinner afterward." Damien paused. "She didn't tell me," Mrs. Alvarez answered gently. "She said she assumed you had meetings this evening." He checked his phone almost instinctively. There was, in fact, a message from Claire sent shortly after lunch. She had simply written, "I'm heading to New Haven for the preservation event this afternoon. Hope your meetings go well." He had never opened it. Buried beneath dozens of business emails and calendar alerts, the notification remained unread. Damien slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling a brief flicker of discomfort he couldn't quite explain. He wandered into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Instead of containers labeled for his late dinners, he found neatly prepared meals portioned for the household staff and a single shelf containing Claire's groceries for the week. fresh fruit, yogurt, herbal tea, and ingredients for recipes she wanted to try. The refrigerator looked organized, but somehow unfamiliar. It no longer revolved around him. That evening he ate alone in the breakfast room. The television remained off. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the grandfather clock marked each passing quarter hour. He found himself looking toward the empty chair across the table several times without realizing it. Across town, Claire laughed with fellow volunteers after the presentation ended. They discussed old architecture, local history, and plans for future restoration work. One of the women smiled and asked, "Your husband must be proud of everything you're doing." Claire hesitated for only a heartbeat before answering honestly, "I hope so." There was no resentment in her voice, only uncertainty. She realized she no longer knew whether Damien even understood how much her world had changed. When she returned home shortly before 10, Damien was sitting in the library with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He looked up as she entered. "How was New Haven?" he asked. "It went well," Claire replied with a genuine smile. "The society approved funding for the next phase of the project." "That's good." Silence settled between them. Damien searched for another question but couldn't think of one. Claire waited politely for a moment, then wished him good night and headed upstairs. As she disappeared from view, Mrs. Alvarez quietly entered the library to collect the untouched coffee cup. She looked toward Damien with the respectful honesty only years of loyal service could earn. "May I say something, sir?" Damien nodded. "Of course." She held the cup for a moment before speaking. A home grows quiet in many ways. Sometimes people stop talking because they're angry. Sometimes they stop talking because they've already made peace with being unheard. Damien frowned slightly. Claire isn't unhappy. She's simply become more independent. Mrs. Alvarez offered a kind but knowing smile. "Perhaps, but I've learned something over the years." She paused before adding softly, "The person who stops waiting is rarely the one who stopped caring first." After she left the room, Damien remained alone beside the cold coffee, replaying her words in his mind. For the first time, the silence inside Whitmore Estate no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something precious had quietly packed its bags long before he ever noticed it was gone. The following Saturday arrived with the kind of quiet autumn sunshine that made Whitmore Estate seem almost untouched by time. Damien canceled his morning meetings for the first time in months, telling himself he simply needed a slower day before another demanding week. Claire had already left before breakfast for a restoration workshop in a neighboring town, leaving behind nothing more than a brief note for Mrs. Alvarez about returning before dinner. Damien wandered through the estate with no particular destination, something he had not done in years. Without conference calls filling every minute, he began noticing details that had somehow escaped him. Fresh flowers no longer stood in the foyer. The music room remained closed. The greenhouse, once filled with Claire tending orchids on Saturday mornings, stood empty except for sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling. None of these changes had happened overnight. They had simply accumulated while his attention remained fixed somewhere else. Looking for a book to occupy the afternoon, Damien entered the library and searched the shelves near the reading corner Claire had always favored. One hardcover volume slipped from the stack, revealing a slim leather notebook hidden behind it. He reached down to return it to its place before realizing the cover looked familiar. It was the journal Claire often carried during their first years of marriage. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to respect her privacy. Yet another part of him remembered Mrs. Alvarez's words from earlier that week. The person who stops waiting is rarely the one who stopped caring first. After several long seconds, he carefully opened the notebook, intending to read only enough to identify whether it contained something important that should remain hidden. The first pages surprised him. They were not filled with complaints or anger. Instead, Claire had recorded ordinary moments she wanted to remember. Damien finally took an entire Sunday off. "We walked the shoreline for 3 miles and laughed about getting lost." Another page read, "He remembered I love cinnamon and hot chocolate. It made my whole week." Damien smiled faintly. He remembered those days. As he turned more pages, the entries gradually became shorter. Canceled dinner. Meeting ran late. Ate alone tonight. Saved him dessert. Anniversary postponed because of travel. He promised we'd celebrate next weekend. Next weekend was crossed out with a single neat line. The following pages continued in the same quiet handwriting. There were no accusations, no dramatic language, just dates, small hopes, and small disappointments that seemed almost insignificant by themselves. Yet together they formed a pattern Damien had never seen before. One page stopped him completely. It was dated nearly 2 years earlier. He apologized for missing dinner again. I realized I was happier hearing the apology than expecting him to come home. That scared me. Damien closed his eyes for a moment before continuing. Several pages later, another entry appeared beneath the heading, Things I Stopped Doing. The list was painfully simple. Waiting by the front window. Keeping dinner warm after 9. Texting to remind him to eat lunch. Buying surprise gifts just because. Planning weekends before asking his schedule. Decorating the house for ordinary Fridays. Damien stared at the words for a long time. He remembered each habit disappearing, but he had never wondered why. He had assumed Claire was becoming more independent, never considering that each missing routine represented something she had quietly let go after hoping for too long. Near the back of the notebook, he found a page with no date at all. It contained only a single sentence written carefully across the center of the paper. Love doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it simply gets tired of waiting to be noticed. Damien swallowed hard. His hands suddenly felt unsteady. He turned one final page. It was the last completed entry, written on the night of Claire's birthday. There were no details about the dinner, no mention of forgotten candles or untouched cake. Just one calm sentence. Tonight, I stopped waiting, and somehow that hurt less than hoping. Damien slowly lowered the notebook onto the table. The library around him remained silent except for the steady ticking of the antique clock above the fireplace. For the first time, he understood that Claire had not changed in a single evening. She had been fading from the life they shared, one quiet disappointment at a time, while he mistook her silence for patience. The realization settled over him with a weight no business crisis had ever carried, because numbers could be repaired, schedules could be rewritten, and contracts could be renegotiated. But he had no idea how to recover years that had quietly slipped away without ever realizing his wife had been writing the story of their distance one ordinary day at a time. Damien did not sleep that night. Long after the lights of Whitmore Estate had gone dark, he remained alone in the library with Claire's notebook resting on the table in front of him. He had returned it exactly where he had found it before she came home, but every sentence remained fixed in his mind. He replayed ordinary memories that had once seemed too small to matter. The dinners he postponed, the weekends he canceled, the messages he meant to answer later, the promises that quietly disappeared beneath the weight of another meeting. For years he had measured success by everything he managed to protect outside his home, never realizing that the one person waiting inside it had been carrying the cost. By sunrise he made a decision. He would stop assuming there would always be another opportunity tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with its usual schedule of meetings, but for the first time Damien interrupted the routine himself. Move my 10 o'clock to Thursday, he told Emily. She looked up from her tablet in surprise. It's the quarterly strategy review. Then they'll survive without me for one day. Emily nodded professionally and immediately began rearranging appointments. Would you like me to clear your afternoon as well? Yes. She paused before asking, is everything all right? Damien hesitated. I'm not sure anymore. It was the most honest answer he had given in years. He drove home just after noon carrying a bouquet of white peonies, Claire's favorite flowers from the first spring they had spent together in Connecticut. On the way, he stopped at the bakery that had supplied desserts for countless charity events hosted at the estate. He ordered the lemon tart Claire always chose instead of chocolate, remembering the detail only because the notebook had forced him to revisit happier days. When he arrived, the house felt unusually bright in the afternoon sunlight. Mrs. Alvarez smiled politely as she opened the door. Mrs. Whitmore is in the studio, sir. Damien found Claire arranging architectural drawings across a large table. Rolls of restoration plans, color samples, and historical photographs surrounded her. She looked genuinely absorbed in her work until she noticed him standing quietly in the doorway. You're home early, she said with mild surprise. Damien held out the flowers. These are for you. Claire blinked before accepting them. They're beautiful. Thank you. She smiled warmly, but the smile carried the same gentle courtesy she might have offered a thoughtful neighbor. It no longer held the effortless familiarity that had once belonged only to him. I thought maybe we could have lunch together, Damien suggested. I brought dessert from Hawthorne Bakery. Claire glanced toward the sketches spread across the table. I appreciate that. I actually promised the restoration committee I'd join a video conference in about 20 minutes. Could it wait? The question escaped before he realized how unfair it sounded. Claire answered kindly instead of defensively. It's important to several people, Damien. I made a commitment. He nodded immediately. Of course. I understand. The words felt strangely unfamiliar because for the first time he truly did understand. She had built responsibilities that no longer revolved around him. That evening Damien canceled another dinner meeting and asked the kitchen to prepare Claire's favorite roasted salmon with wild rice and asparagus. He even lit candles himself, carefully setting the table the way she once had. When Claire came downstairs, she stopped for a moment, surprised by the effort. "This looks lovely," she said. They shared a quiet meal together, speaking about her restoration project, the literacy center, and the changing leaves across the estate. Damien listened carefully, asking questions instead of checking his phone. More than once he caught himself reaching for the device before deliberately setting it farther away. For a brief moment, he felt hopeful. After dinner he asked softly, "Would you like to take a walk through the gardens?" Claire looked toward the windows where darkness had already settled outside. "Maybe another evening. I still have notes to prepare before tomorrow." "All right." She smiled apologetically. "Thank you for dinner. It meant a lot." She leaned forward, gently squeezed his hand for just a second, and walked upstairs carrying her notebook and folders. Damien remained at the table long after the dishes had been cleared away. The evening had been pleasant. Claire had been gracious, thoughtful, and genuinely appreciative. Yet something essential was still missing. She had accepted his kindness without reaching back toward him. He finally understood that forgiveness could begin with a smile, but trust returned much more slowly. Flowers, favorite desserts, and one carefully planned dinner could not erase years of quiet absence. For the first time in his life, Damien realized he was no longer trying to win an argument or solve a problem. He was trying to earn his way back into a place in Claire's heart that he had once believed would always belong to him simply because they were married. 3 days after their quiet dinner, Damien arrived at his office expecting another ordinary Thursday. Instead, he found the executive conference room filled with tense faces. A long-term property acquisition that represented months of negotiations had unexpectedly stalled. One of the preservation organizations involved had withdrawn its support overnight, placing several related agreements at risk. Emily stood beside the presentation screen, calmly summarizing the situation. Their board voted against the proposal late yesterday. Without their endorsement, the city council is delaying final approval. Damien studied the documents spread across the table. Every financial projection depended on those signatures. Did anyone explain why they changed their position? Emily shook her head. Only that they no longer believe the restoration commitments are genuine. Damien frowned. His company had already allocated millions of dollars toward preserving historic landmarks connected to the project. The accusation made no sense. For the next 2 hours, attorneys, consultants, and advisors debated possible solutions, yet every option seemed to lead back to the same obstacle. During a short break, Emily quietly approached him. "There's something else." She handed him a folder containing letters from community organizations. As he skimmed the pages, one familiar name caught his attention. Claire Whitmore. She wasn't listed as an executive or spokesperson. Instead, several board members referred to her as the person who had personally convinced local preservation groups that the Whitmore family genuinely valued historical restoration. Damien looked up in surprise. "Claire knows these people?" Emily gave a small nod. "More than knows them. She's worked alongside many of them for months." Several letters mentioned that they trusted the project because of her involvement. Damien felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He had assumed Claire's volunteer work was simply a hobby that made her happy. He had never asked enough questions to understand how respected she had become. Before he could respond, his phone rang. Mrs. Alvarez's name appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir," she said gently, "but Mrs. Whitmore asked me to tell you she left early this morning for Hartford. She said there was an emergency meeting with the Preservation Council." Hartford. Damien immediately looked back at the folder in his hands. Without another word, he excused himself from the conference room and instructed his driver to head north. The trip took just under 2 hours. By the time he arrived at the historic government building where the meeting was being held, the afternoon sun had begun to soften across the streets. He quietly entered the public gallery at the back of the room. Claire stood near the front beside architects, historians, and civic leaders. She spoke with calm confidence, never raising her voice, carefully explaining why responsible restoration required patience, transparency, and long-term commitment. She never mentioned Damien by name. She never defended him because he was her husband. She defended the project because she believed communities deserved to preserve their history while creating opportunities for future generations. As questions continued, Damien noticed something remarkable. People listened to Claire with genuine respect. They trusted her judgment because she had earned it through months of consistent work, not because of the Whitmore name. After the meeting concluded, several council members thanked her personally. One elderly commissioner smiled warmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've spent more weekends in these restoration sites than most of us. Your word carries weight because you've always shown up." Damien remained standing where he was, unable to look away. For years he had believed he alone protected the Whitmore legacy through business decisions and leadership. Yet while he had been building contracts, Claire had quietly built trust. She had strengthened relationships no amount of money could purchase. She had protected the family's reputation without asking for recognition, and she had done it while feeling increasingly forgotten inside her own marriage. Claire finally noticed Damien waiting near the exit. Genuine surprise crossed her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Damien looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I came because I finally realized I didn't know what you were really doing." Claire smiled gently. It was never a secret. Those simple words struck him harder than any criticism could have. She was right. She had spoken about meetings, restoration plans, volunteers, and community projects for months. He had simply never listened long enough to understand. As they walked together toward the parking lot beneath a sky painted with late autumn colors, Damien carried no illusion that one meaningful afternoon could repair years of neglect. But he understood something he had missed for far too long. The strongest support holding his world together had never been the assistant who organized his calendar or the executives who managed his business. It had been the quiet woman walking beside him, faithfully strengthening the foundation of his life while asking for nothing more than to be remembered. The weeks that followed did not transform Damien overnight, and he no longer expected them to. Instead of searching for one grand gesture that might erase years of quiet disappointment, he began changing the smallest parts of every ordinary day. He silenced his phone during dinner, even if they shared only 20 peaceful minutes together. He asked Claire about the restoration projects before mentioning work, then listened until she finished every story without checking a single notification. He learned the names of the volunteers she admired, remembered which historic buildings had become her favorites, and quietly rearranged meetings so he could attend the public reopening of the restored community hall she had spent months helping preserve. No announcements were made. No photographs were taken. He simply sat in the last row and applauded with everyone else when Claire accepted a certificate of appreciation on behalf of the volunteers. She noticed him only after the ceremony ended, and the surprise smile she gave him lingered in his thoughts for the rest of the evening. Autumn gradually gave way to the first hints of winter. Maple leaves disappeared from the long driveway of Whitmore Estate, replaced by bare branches stretching toward clear skies. One Friday afternoon, Damien asked Mrs. Alvarez for a quiet favor. "Could you help me set the dining room exactly as it looked a few months ago?" She understood immediately. Together they arranged the same white candles, the same crystal glasses, the same silverware Claire had carefully chosen for that forgotten birthday. Damien drove to the same bakery and ordered another chocolate cake with delicate white frosting and tiny silver stars. This time there was no audience, no celebration planned, and no expectation that one evening could repair everything. When Claire returned home from the literacy center just after sunset, she paused in the doorway of the dining room. The familiar table stood waiting beneath the warm chandelier, looking almost exactly as it had on the night she had quietly blown out a single candle alone. She looked from the table to Damien, who stood beside it without flowers, wrapped gifts, or prepared speeches. Only honesty remained. "I know today isn't your birthday," he said softly. "I also know I can never give you back the night I took from you." Claire remained silent, allowing him to continue. "For a long time, I believed providing a beautiful home meant I was taking care of our marriage. I thought loving you in my heart was enough, even when I stopped showing it with my time, my attention, and my presence. I kept waiting for a future when work would slow down and I would finally become the husband you deserved." He glanced briefly at the untouched cake before meeting her eyes again. "The truth is that tomorrow never arrives for people who keep postponing the ones they love." Claire slowly walked toward the table. The room remained so quiet that the faint ticking of the grandfather clock drifted in from the hallway. Damien lit a single candle and stepped back instead of standing beside her. I'm not asking you to forget anything, he said. I'm not asking you to pretend those years didn't happen. I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what I failed to see. Claire looked at the small flame dancing above the candle. Months earlier, she had made a wish before blowing it out alone. Tonight, she simply watched it for a long moment before turning toward Damien. Do you know what hurt the most? She asked gently. He shook his head. It wasn't that you forgot one birthday. It was believing that if I waited a little longer, next year would be different. Damien lowered his eyes. I know. Claire studied him carefully. For the first time in many months, she saw no hurried explanations, no promises built on future intentions, and no confidence that everything would somehow fix itself. She saw a man who had finally learned that love could not survive on assumptions alone. She reached forward, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge the present, and lightly rested her hand over his. I don't think trust returns all at once, she said. Neither do I, Damien answered. Then we'll let it return one ordinary day at a time. Together they stood beside the candle until the flame slowly burned lower. Neither of them rushed to blow it out. They shared slices of cake while talking about simple things, the literacy center, the restored community hall, the gardens that would bloom again in spring, and the quiet weekend they planned to spend walking the Connecticut shoreline where happier memories had first begun. Outside, the evening settled peacefully over Whitmore Estate, but inside the house something almost forgotten found its way home again. It was not perfection, nor the illusion that love never falters. It was the choice to remember every single day that the smallest acts of attention are often the strongest proof that a heart still belongs where it always should.